Before we dive in, if this video gets you thinking like a security professional, imagine what a full guide could do. Think like a CISSP teaches you the senior security mindset that separates candidates who pass from experienced engineers who fail. Reason like a security leader, not just a technician. $25 at zerodaylabs.tech. Link in the description. The system is breached. 40,000 customer records are exfiltrated. The board asks, what was our expected annual loss from this type of event? The CISO has no answers because no one ever ran the numbers. That is not a technical failure. That is a risk management failure. And that scenario is exactly what the CISSP exam tests. This is D1 Part 2 of the CISSP Domain Mastery Series, mapping to Exam Objective 1.4. Today, the risk vocabulary the exam demands. Quantitative risk formulas with a worked example, qualitative versus quantitative assessment, risk response strategies, threat modeling with STRIDE, PASTA, and attack
Risk
trees,
management
and
starts
the
with
NIST risk
vocabulary.
management
The exam
framework.
will use these
Everything
terms
here is
precisely.
exam
You
tested.
need to match
Nothing
that
is background.
precision.
An asset is anything of value the organization must protect. Hardware, data, intellectual property, reputation, all assets. A threat is any potential event that could cause harm to an asset. A threat agent, sometimes called a threat actor, is the entity that carries out the threat. An external attacker, a malicious insider, a natural disaster. A vulnerability is a weakness in a system, process, or control that a threat can exploit. Risk is the probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability and cause harm. Risk equals threat times vulnerability. Conceptually, exposure is the condition of being susceptible to loss. A system with an unpatched vulnerability is exposed. Impact is the magnitude of harm if a risk is realized. And residual risk is the risk that remains after controls are applied. You cannot eliminate all risk. You manage it to an acceptable level. That acceptable level is determined by the organization's risk appetite and set by senior management, not by the security team. The quantitative formulas are non-negotiable on the CISSP. Memorize them, know how to apply them in a scenario. Asset value, abbreviated AV, is the dollar value of the asset being protected. Exposure factor, EF, is the percentage of asset value lost if a threat is realized. A threat that destroys half the asset has an exposure factor of 50% or 0.5. Single loss expectancy, SLE, is the expected loss from one occurrence of the threat. SLE equals asset value multiplied by exposure factor. If an asset is worth $100,000 and the exposure factor is 40%, the SLE is $40,000. Annualized rate of occurrence, ARO, is how many times per year the threat is expected to occur. A threat expected once every 2 years has an ARO of 0.5. Annualized loss expectancy, ALE, is the expected loss per year from that threat. ALE equals SLE multiplied by ARO. If SLE is 40,000 and ARO is 0.5, ALE is $20,000 per year. Safeguard value, if a control costs $15,000 per year and reduces ALE from $20,000 to $3,000, the net benefit is $2,000 per year. That control is financially justified. The exam will give you numbers and ask you to calculate. ALE before minus ALE after minus annual cost of safeguard equals the value of the safeguard. There are 3 risk assessment approaches. Qualitative assessment uses subjective scales, high, medium, low, no dollar figures, faster to perform and easier to communicate to non-technical stakeholders. The Delphi method is a structured qualitative technique that collects anonymous expert opinions through multiple rounds until consensus is reached. Quantitative assessment assigns numeric values, dollar amounts, probabilities, frequencies. It produces ALE, which allows direct comparison to safeguard cost. More rigorous but requires reliable data and more time to perform. Semi-quantitative assessment combines both. Qualitative labels map to numeric ranges. The exam may describe a scenario and ask which approach was used. Key discriminator: if the output includes dollar figures, it is quantitative. If it uses categories like high, medium, or low without dollar values, it is qualitative. Most organizations use a risk matrix. Probability on one axis, impact on the other. The result of any risk assessment feeds the risk treatment decision. Once you know the risk, you have 4 response options. Some candidates remember them with the acronym TARA. Transfer: shift the financial impact to a third party. Purchasing cyber insurance transfers risk. Outsourcing to a vendor transfers some operational risk, but never the legal or regulatory accountability. The organization always retains liability for its own data. Avoid: eliminate the activity that creates the risk. If a feature creates unacceptable risk, do not build it. This is not always practical. Some risk is inherent to doing business. Reduce, also called mitigate. Implement controls that lower likelihood or impact. Patching, encryption, access controls. These all reduce risk. Accept, acknowledge the risk, and choose not to act on it. This is a deliberate management decision, not inaction. Risk acceptance must be documented and signed off by the appropriate authority. Senior management accepts risk. Security professionals advise. After applying any response, residual risk remains. If the residual risk exceeds the organization's risk tolerance, additional controls are required. Threat modeling is the process of identifying threats to a system before they can be exploited. STRIDE is the Microsoft model and the one the CISSP tests most directly. Each letter maps to a threat category and the security property it violates. Spoofing violates authentication, pretending to be someone you are not, a fake login page, a spoofed email sender. Tampering violates integrity, unauthorized modification of data, altering a log file, injecting malicious data into a stream. Repudiation violates non-repudiation, denying that an action was performed. This is why audit logs and digital signatures exist. Information disclosure, violates confidentiality, exposing data to unauthorized parties. Denial of service, violates availability, preventing legitimate users from accessing the system. Elevation of privilege, violates authorization, gaining access or capabilities beyond what is authorized. A regular user escalating to admin, a guest account reading sensitive files. Stride is used to evaluate each component of a system and ask what could go wrong here and which threat category does it fall into. Beyond Stride, the exam may reference two other models. PASTA stands for Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. It is a 7-stage risk-centric methodology. PASTA aligns threat modeling to business objectives and produces attack simulations. It is used when you need to connect technical threats to business impact. Attack trees are a structured hierarchical representation of how an attacker could achieve a goal. The root node is the attacker's objective. Child nodes represent the steps or preconditions required to reach that objective. Attack trees help analysts enumerate paths to compromise and prioritize defenses. DREAD was an older Microsoft scoring model. Damage potential, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users' discoverability. It has largely been deprecated, but older exam questions may reference it. Know that it produces a numeric risk score for each threat. The exam may describe a scenario and ask which modeling approach is being used. Stride identifies what can go wrong. PASTA models how it happens in a business context. Attack trees show the path to exploitation. The NIST Risk Management Framework defines 7 steps for integrating risk management into system development and operations. Step 1. Prepare. Establish the context, priorities, and resources before starting. Step 2. Categorize. Classify the information system and its data based on impact. FIPS 199 and NIST 860 guide this step. Step 3. Select. Choose appropriate security controls from NIST 853. Step 4. Implement. Deploy and configure the selected controls. Step 5. Assess. Evaluate whether controls are implemented correctly and producing the intended outcome. Step 6. Authorize. A senior official. The authorizing official formally accepts residual risk. This is a management decision, not a technical one. Step 7. Monitor. Continuously track control effectiveness changes and new threats. The exam may ask about the order of steps or which step a scenario falls into. Categorize comes before select. Assess comes before authorize. Monitor is ongoing. ISO 31000 is an international risk management standard providing principles and guidelines. FAIR. Factor analysis of information risk, but is a quantitative framework for measuring and managing information risk in financial terms. It is increasingly referenced in enterprise risk management contexts. Supply chain risk is a growing exam topic. Third-party vendors, cloud providers, software developers, and hardware manufacturers all introduce risk into your organization's security posture. The exam tests 3 key supply chain controls: vendor assessment and due diligence. Evaluate the security posture of third parties before engaging them. Review SOC2 reports, penetration test results, and certifications. Right-to-audit clauses, contractual provisions that allow your organization to audit the vendor's security controls. If a vendor refuses a right-to-audit clause, that is a risk indicator. Service-level agreements define the security and operational commitments the vendor must meet. SLAs create accountability. Remember, outsourcing an activity transfers some risk, but never regulatory accountability. If a vendor breaches your customer data, your organization still answers to the regulator. Question 1. A server worth $200,000 is at risk of ransomware. Analysis shows a 40% exposure factor and an expected occurrence of twice per year. What is the annualized loss expectancy? Answer. SLE equals 200,000 times 0.4, which is 80,000. ALE equals 80,000 times 2, which is $160,000 per year. Question 2. An organization's risk assessment identifies high likelihood, high impact risks in a matrix using categories of critical, high, medium, and low. No dollar values are produced. This is an example of which type of risk assessment. Answer. Qualitative. Categories without dollar figures define qualitative assessment. Question 3. A threat modeling session identifies a risk where an attacker could gain administrator access by exploiting a privilege escalation vulnerability in a web application. Using Stride, which threat category does this represent? Answer. Elevation of privilege. The attacker is gaining capabilities beyond what is authorized. Elevation of privilege maps to the authorization property in Stride. 4 flashcards before you go. 1. AL equals SLE times ARO. SLE equals asset value times exposure factor. 2. Risk responses. Transfer, avoid, reduce, accept. Management accepts risk. Security professionals advise. 3. Stride. Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. 4. NIST RMF. Prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, monitor. Assess before authorize. Monitor is continuous. That is Domain 1 Part 2, next episode D1P3. Business continuity planning, disaster recovery, and personnel security policies. Test yourself right now at zerodaylabs.tech. Adaptive practice exams built for CISSP, and if you want the managerial mindset that decides borderline questions, think like a CISSP is in the description. Subscribe and we will see you in Part 3.